I'm happy at this point to welcome Joanne Heslop, who is the Student Transitions Project Manager. As you know, BC CAT is turning 35 next year, and the STP project is turning 20. And here to tell us about what we have learned over the last 2 decades of student mobility research, I'm going to pass it over to Joanne, who's going to walk us through a review with some reflections.
Thanks, Mike. So, in fact, the STP has not turned 20, but we have 20 years of data. I think we're maybe 17 or 18. I haven't actually done the math, but anyways, 20 years of data. So this is my presentation, 20 years of STP, review and reflections. Now, for those of you who are familiar with my presentations, I do reward people with questions. If you ask me a question anytime throughout the presentation, you will be rewarded with a candy. I have an assistant in the audience who's going to help deliver those candies because I don't know if I can throw them all the way to the back. So please raise your hand with a question at any time. I will try to keep an eye out for those questions because I'm completely and totally blinded by those lights back there. So you might have to jump up and down. So in terms of an agenda, I'm going to start with what is the STP. Then we'll look very briefly at what we mean by 20 years of data and some fun facts. And then the main part of my presentation will be looking at some significant events that happened over the last 20 years, and we'll look at some of the STP insights in regards to those events. So what is the Student Transitions Project? It is a collaborative effort. It involves the Ministry of Post-Secondary Education and Future Skills, as well as the Ministry of Education and Childcare, and the 25 post-secondary institutions, including the 4 research-intensive universities and the 21 CDW institutions, that's colleges, institutes, and the teaching-intensive universities. And of course, BC CAT is also a partner in this research. And there's a 5-member steering committee that includes 1 member from each of those partnerships. There's 2 from the post-secondary institutions. And then we have the Ministry of Education and Childcare. They house the data. They are the data custodians. And then I'm the manager of the STP, so I coordinate a lot of the data collection and the data quality. I do all the data analysis. I produce a number of reports, and I deliver presentations like this one. So in terms of the history of the STP, it was actually launched in the spring of 2005. It was an agreement that was signed between the 2 education ministries, the Central Data Warehouse institutions, and the BC universities. And this agreement established a formal mechanism to enable the exchange of personal information while protecting individual privacy. And it was for the purpose of investigating student transitions, student mobility, and outcomes from the K-12 to BC's public post-secondary institutions. And it had a goal of providing reliable information at predictable times in a timely manner to support institutions and government with planning. In terms of a methodology, we link the personal education number, which is also known as the PEN. We link that between the education systems to track student transitions and student mobility. And personal privacy is protected because we encrypt the PEN and we remove all the personal information. And then there's a number of different research outputs, including pivot tables and dashboards that are available to authorized users. And then there's a number of reports and publications that are available on the STP website. Any questions so far? No? Okay. So in terms of 20 years of data, what am I talking about here? There's 20 years of grade 12 graduation cohorts from 2001-02 all the way up to 2020-21. We also have 20 post-secondary registration years by academic year from 02-03 to 21-22. We also talk about things like immediate entry transitions. What are we talking about there? That's where we take one grade 12 graduation cohort and we say who enrolls in post-secondary within a year of graduation. So that line there kind of indicates the immediate entry transitioners from 01-02 who enroll in post-secondary in 02-03. Or we might talk about delayed entry transitions. There's a 1-year delay or a 2-year delay and so forth. Of course, we can do a 20-year delay by taking that 01-02 cohort and quantifying how many actually transitioned in 2021-22, and I think it's only like 1%. But we can look at cumulative transition rates. So if we follow a cohort of grade 12 graduates for 20 years, what proportion ultimately enrolled in BC public post-secondary education? And what I'm drawing here is a cumulative transition rate, so immediate entry was 51%, 68% cumulatively from that cohort transitioned to post-secondary within 3 years, 73% in 5 years, and so forth. So by the time we get to 20 years out, we have 81% of that first cohort of graduates from 2001-02, from 02-03, they transitioned, and then 81% cumulatively over 20 years. So that's, I think, pretty significant portion of a high school cohort to show up in BC public post-secondary, and that doesn't count the ones that actually enrolled in BC private institutions or outside of BC, which might be another 5 to 7%. So here's a few little fun facts. We have 20 years of data, which is 18 million student enrollment records. I have lots of data to work with. That's 2.8 million unique students and 1.3 post-secondary credentials awarded, so that includes 445,000 bachelor's degrees. So that's the data we're working with. And so now I'll move on to looking at 20 years of STP, significant events, and STP insights. So when we realized that we had 20 years of data, we surveyed many of our STP users and we asked them, what do you think are some of those significant events that occurred over the last 20 years? And so based on what they thought were important events, I decided I would focus on those events and provide you with some insights on what the STP data tells us about how those events have influenced what students do and how that affects enrollments and so forth. So looking at the period of time from 2002 to 2022, one of the events was the indigenization of post-secondary education, and I think that really spans the full 20 years. Of course, there is the Truth and Reconciliation Commission report in 2015, but we also had another significant event which also spans the full 20 years, which is the gender gap between males and females. We seem to have more females represented in post-secondary education than we do males, so we'll look at that. In 2004, we had the changes in the institutional mandates, and that spanned until about 2008, when we had the recession. And then we also have some student mobility myth busting. Keep you wondering about what that might be. And then there was the international education strategy in 2012 and the extreme growth in international students over the subsequent years. And then we'll finish with a look at COVID-19. So let's begin with the indigenization of post-secondary education. So how do immediate entry transition rates compare between non-Indigenous and Indigenous students? Well, the immediate entry transition rate of Indigenous students are lower than the rates for non-Indigenous students. And this gap is typically about 11 to 13 percentage points, and it even widened further to about 15 percentage points between those two groups during the pandemic, for the pandemic graduates of 2019-20. So you can see the line at the top there represents the transition rate of the non-Indigenous students, which is above 50%, and the Indigenous students below 50%. And you can see those yellow dots there represents those pandemic graduates where the gap widened even further. But why is it important to look beyond just the immediate entry transition rates? Well, Indigenous students, they tend to delay their transition to post-secondary education, and this transition rate gap narrows over the number of years since grade 12 graduation. So what I've plotted here is the cumulative transition rate of Indigenous students. So their immediate entry transition rate is 38%. Within 5 years for a different cohort, but nevertheless, 62% transition rate cumulatively for that cohort. And then for another cohort where we have 10 years of data, the cumulative transition rate was 71%. And then when we compare that to the non-Indigenous students, you can see although their transition rates cumulatively are higher, the gap does tend to narrow over time. And so you can see at the immediate entry transition rate, there was about a 12 percentage point gap between those two groups. And then this narrowed to about 5% when we give enough time to those Indigenous students for their delayed entry transitions. And so what is the rate of growth in the Indigenous student enrollment in the BC public post-secondary system? We've seen a 43% growth rate in the number of Indigenous students in the BC public post-secondary system. And if we compare that to the total enrollment growth over that time for all students combined, that was only a 14% growth rate. And by Indigenous group, I mean, we do ask the students to self-identify whether they are First Nations, Inuit, or Métis. Of course, there are a fair number of students who don't specify, but we see that that group has actually begun to decline by 8% over the 20-year period. But the First Nations students, there is a 57% rate of growth for that group of students, with a bit of a more recent decline, perhaps due to COVID. And then the Métis students, there's been a 5-fold increase in the number of Métis students in the post-secondary system. And similarly, a 5-fold increase in the number of Inuit students, although that is a smaller population. And then, of course, there's a number of students that self-declare in multiple categories. And so is that rate of growth in post-secondary Indigenous students consistent across all institution types? Well, if we look at the number of Indigenous students in colleges, that's down 7% over 20 years, up 11% in the institutes over 20 years. Research-intensive universities has grown by 50%, and in the teaching-intensive universities, a decline of 4%. But of course, the enrollments have changed quite a bit overall in these different institution types, so it might be better to look at the proportion of Indigenous students in each of the institution types to make sure that we're actually showing a growing share of Indigenous students in our post-secondary system. And in fact, that's what we see here. So the percentage of Indigenous students in colleges has grown from 6% of the total to 8%. In the institutes, it has doubled from 3% to 6% over 20 years. And in the research-intensive universities, also doubled from 2% to 4%. And the TIUs has remained at about 7%. So overall, we've seen a growth in the share of Indigenous students in the post-secondary system from 5% of the total to 6%. So I'm going to move on to gender gap unless anybody wants a candy. No questions? Somebody's scratching their head? All right then, no candies. Gender gap. So to what extent are females overrepresented in BC's education systems? So if we look at the percentage of female students amongst different subpopulations in our post-secondary system, we see that 59% of the graduate students, so master's, PhD, and other graduate level programs, 59% are females. But if we look at that population of students who enrolled immediately in post-secondary education after graduation, that proportion who are female is 53%. If we look at the total population of undergraduate students enrolled, the females represents 52%. But when we look at just the grade 12 graduates, it's pretty evenly split, males and females, 50-50. By the time students graduate with a credential from the BC public post-secondary system, we find that bachelor's degree completers are 59% female. Master's degree completers are 60-something, I have to put on my glasses. 61% female. And then the PhD students, that's the wrong button. There we go. So doctorate completers, they're less than 50% female. So that means that the doctorate students are male-dominated group. That's the only group that I studied here out of this sort of spurious collection of subpopulations in which the males were the more dominant group. But we can look by program later on in the next slide. But where did the boys go? So as we move through the levels of education, we see proportionately fewer males. So if we look at this kind of from a funnel perspective, so now we're looking at percentage males, not percentage females. So 50% of the grade 12 graduates are male. By the time we enroll directly in post-secondary, we only have 47% of that group are male. If they complete a bachelor's degree, we're left with only 41% males. And if they go as far as completing a master's degree, it's 39% males. So you saw earlier on the other slide that the PhD students were more likely to be male. So what's going on here? So 54% of PhD graduates are male. But if you break them out between domestic and international, we see that there's proportionately fewer male domestic PhD graduates and proportionally more male international PhD graduates. So I guess we're bringing in the males for those PhD programs. And is the representation of females consistent across the BC system by institution type and by program? So when we look at the percentage of females in the teaching-intensive universities and the research-intensive universities and the colleges, we see actually that the percentage of females is declining a little bit overall in each of them. And I'm not throwing it, it's getting delivered.
And you
I gave away my candy, sorry.
Anyway, Tracy Hoot from Thompson Rivers University. I know that your data has included graduation numbers. The dual credit students, are they included in that data? Because typically those dual credit students start in grade 12 and they finish the program usually while they're in grade 12.
In the data that I'm presenting today, no, not likely. You know, when we look at those transition rates, we take the students who have graduated from grade 12 and follow them beyond grade 12 graduation into post-secondary. But we do have a mechanism to allow us to track those students who are enrolled in post-secondary at the same time that they're in grade 12. But I'm not presenting that data today. Good question, thanks. Any other questions? Oh, I see another hand at the back.
Hi, my name is Patty Urquhart. I'm from Langara College, and my pronouns are she, her. And I had a question about the definition of the denominator in your percentages. So the question I have is, in the initial graphs, this is really loud, my teacher's voices. In the initial graphs, you're doing, in the denominator, male and female, correct?
Yes.
And then in the second graph, when you're tracking, when you say, let's just focus on the men or the males, or people who identify as males, then the denominator is men?
No, the denominator was all students in that category. So maybe I can go back. That might be hard to do. Time is ticking. Okay, there it is.
There.
So I start with all grade 12 graduation students, all students who graduated, so 50% were male. And then I look at all students who enrolled immediately in post-secondary from a grade 12 graduation cohort, 47% were male. Then I take all the students who completed a bachelor's degree, 41% of all those bachelor's completers were male, and so forth.
So when you said you have 61%, I wrote down 61, so that's 39% master's degree. That is just domestic males over male and female, or
that was all master's degree completers. So 39% of all master's degree completers, domestic and international combined, 39% were male.
Okay, so then the last step with the PhD, that the majority were male.
Yeah.
How are you calculating that difference, attributing to the international?
What I did is I said, well, what proportion of all domestic PhD graduates are male? And that's 49%. And what proportion of all international PhD graduates are male? And that's 62%. Maybe we should talk offline later.
Yeah, thank you.
Okay. Okay, so I'm just going to zoom, and I'm going to get back onto institutional mandates, and I'm still happy to take more questions later on. So in 2004 to 2008, we had a number of institutional mandate changes. As you probably know, we have currently 25 BC public post-secondary institutions, and they're categorized into the different institution types: colleges, institutes, teaching-intensive universities, and research-intensive universities. And with changes to the institutional mandates, we've had a shift in the number of institutions in each of those categories. At one time, we actually had 12 colleges. We now have 11. On the next slide, I'll give you some more details on how that all happened. For the institutes, we currently have 3 institutes. We no longer have university colleges, but we do have 7 teaching-intensive universities, and we have a number of research-intensive universities, depending on how you want to count them, because UBCO and UBC Vancouver is actually one institution, 2 different campuses. But we'll look at those details here on this slide. So I've plotted the number of years across the top. It's about 20 years there. The list of the BC colleges are listed here. If you're not familiar with the acronyms, I'll run through them here. It's Camosun, Coast Mountain, College of New Caledonia, College of the Rockies, Douglas College, Langara College, North Island College, Northern Lights College, Okanagan College, Selkirk, and Vancouver Community College. So all of those have always been colleges except for Okanagan College, which had previously been a university college. So it became a college in 2004-05. And then in terms of the institutes, we currently have 3. There's BCIT, JIBC, and Nicola Valley Institute of Technology. The Institute of Indigenous Government was absorbed by NVIT in 2007-08. And then we have the research-intensive universities. UBCO was created in 2005-06. And then this is where it gets all kind of messy with the teaching-intensive universities. So Capilano was a college up until it became a TIU in 2008-09. At the same time, Emily Carr Institute of Art and Design became a university. And also at the same time, Kwantlen Polytechnic University was formed from Kwantlen College. Also, the University of Fraser Valley was created and became a teaching-intensive university from its former state as a university college. Vancouver Island University was Malaspina College. Prior to that, or subsequent to that, it was Malaspina University College, so now it's a TIU. And then, of course, also listed here is Thompson Rivers University, which had previously been a university college called Caribou College? And then, of course, we have the Royal Roads University, which is a teaching-intensive university. And this is according to the government's designations of these institution types. So there you have the full history of all the institutional mandate changes. If I've made any mistakes on this, please let me know, because this is a bit of a project trying to put this data together. So changes to institutional mandates have broadened bachelor's degree completion opportunities, and all of the research universities, the TIUs, and the institutes now award bachelor's degrees, and all but 2 colleges, which is Coast Mountain and College of New Caledonia. Of course, they do have degree completion pathways through the transfer system. But when we look at the growing share of institutions awarding bachelor's degrees, we see that 80% of our colleges are now offering bachelor's degrees. And since all of the other institution types are offering bachelor's degrees, we see that 92% of all of our institutions are offering bachelor's degrees. And we sort of hit this steady state in about 2011-12. So what we are seeing then is a growing share of bachelor's degrees are awarded at the colleges, the institutes, and the teaching-intensive universities. And so what we're seeing is that the research-intensive universities 20 years ago were awarding 80% of the bachelor's degrees, and now, despite the growth in the number of bachelor's degrees awarded at the research universities, this only represents 73% of the total bachelor's degrees awarded, because the teaching-intensive universities, the colleges, and the institutes are now awarding 27% of the bachelor's degrees, when it was formerly just 20% at those institution types. And in terms of the total growth in bachelor's degrees over 20 years, it's gone from about 16,500 to about 27,500 over the 20-year period here. And so the number of bachelor's degrees awarded at the TIUs, at the colleges, and the institutes has more than doubled, 2.3 times in 20 years, compared to just 1.5 times in the research-intensive universities. And so, of course, student mobility rates are declining as bachelor's degree completion opportunities widen. And this plot here is just showing you the number of academic credit registrants, and this is the group of students from which we quantify student mobility, and that is how many students are switching from one institution to another from one year to the next. And the number of mobile students from that population is plotted here, and you can see that the number of mobile students did grow over time, and then it started to decline at a steeper rate than the number of academic credit registrants in the system. And as a result, what we've seen is ever since that sort of steady state of 92% of our institutions offering bachelor's degrees, we're seeing a decline in the student mobility rate, which is the proportion of students that switch institutions. So bachelor's degree completion opportunities around the province seems to have had some influence on the number of students that are switching institutions. Any questions before I move on? Yes, there's one here. I think you'll need to wait for the microphone. Oh. I don't have my candies anymore. I relinquished responsibility.
Where is it?
Here comes the mic.
Hello. Thank you. My name is Thomas Gomes. I represent from Exende School of Management. My question is for you, actually. When I was looking into more detail, you have presented fantastic data, really. It's impressive. In BC, actually, we have got more than 65 community agreement institutions, post-secondary institutions. In your slide, number 23 slides, you have represented all public institutions. So is there any reason, actually, why you didn't include any private post-secondary institutions? Just curious, actually, it's not a question.
Yeah, we focus on the public institutions because we don't collect data from the private institutions, primarily because there's no personal education number on the private institution registrants. We do make some attempts every few years to quantify students going into BC private institutions and non-BC institutions by using student financial aid data, because we're able to do some data linkages and look at where they applied for financial assistance. And there is some BC private data in that data set, but that's really, it's just the lack of data, so we don't report on it.
Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, I'm going to move quickly on to the next slide, which is just a brief look at the recession of 2008. So did rising unemployment rates during the 2008 recession influence student transition rates? Well, if we look at the BC unemployment rate trend, what we can see is that in September of 2008, the unemployment rate was 4.7%, and it rose to 8.4% by June of 2009. And so what happened to the immediate entry transition rate trend? It seems that in that same time period, we also hit the highest immediate entry transition rate. Perhaps there's a relationship there. We also noticed that the total post-secondary enrollment continued to rise during this period. So how about that student mobility myth busting? What's that all about? So before the STP, many people believed that student mobility in BC was primarily the movement of students from colleges and institutes to the research-intensive universities. But in December of 2010, the STP created a student mobility diagram, and it revealed that students move in all directions between all institution types and not just college to university. And most of you folks know that that is in fact the case, because the STP has been releasing data to show that for many years now. But this was the original diagram showing the student mobility between the different institution types. And we have modernized it since then because we've split the institutes out from the colleges. And so this is allowing to inform us that students do move in all directions. But we're also seeing that fewer students are moving to the research-intensive universities from other institution types. So I'm going to move on to the international education strategy. So in 2012, BC's international education strategy included a goal of increasing the number of international students choosing BC as their study destination by 50% over 4 years. So that meant that we needed to increase the number of BC K-12 international students by 6,000 and the number in the BC public post-secondary system by about 14,000. And according to my sleuthing, it looks like we actually achieved that, and then some in the post-secondary system at plus 6,100 and plus 16,000. And of course, international enrollment continues to grow in BC, so let's have a closer look at that. So when we look at the international student growth in the BC grade 12 graduates, we don't actually have a label to identify international students, but we do have something called non-resident status, which we can use as a proxy for international students in the K-12 system. And what we saw over the first decade of this 20-year period is that the number of grade 12 graduates grew from about 880 to 1,600 over the first half of that decade, so that's an 86% growth rate. And then over the second half of the decade, it looked like it was going to be a lot steeper, but then it got hit with COVID, and so the number of international students over that second half of the decade was a 90% growth rate. But overall, there's 3.8 times as many international grade 12 graduates as there were 20 years ago. And when we look at the post-secondary side, we see we began 20 years ago with 17,000 odd international students, and that grew to 32,000, so an 84% rate of growth. And then over the next half of the decade, we see steeper growth, and the percentage of growth rate there was 151%. So we now have 4.6 times as many international post-secondary students in the system as we had 20 years ago. But was international enrollment growth consistent across institution types? If we look at the headcount of international students, we see that it was pretty flat over the early half of this 20-year period for the colleges, and then it really took off. But they now have 4 times as many international students as they did 20 years ago. And similarly for the institutes, with now, can't read that, 6 or 8 times. And then with the research-intensive universities, pretty steady growth, and they now have 5 times as many international students as they had 20 years ago. And then the TIUs with 4 times as many. So total, they have grown from 18,000 international students with 15,000 over the first half of this 20-year period, with much more significant growth over the second half. So now we have 81,500 international students in the BC public system. So what is the proportion of international students in each of these institution types? We've seen the share of international students in colleges has grown from 4% to 17%, and in the institutes it has also grown significantly, and in the research-intensive universities, and similarly in the teaching-intensive universities. And so overall, the proportion of international students across the BC public post-secondary system has grown from, was that 5% up to 19% currently. So when we look at the post-secondary internationalization by country, referring back to that 2012 international education strategy, it suggested that we build on existing long-term relationships with USA, China, and South Korea, and target emerging economies like India, Brazil, and Mexico. So let's see what happened there. With China, over 20 years, the share of international students coming to BC from China has actually shrunk from 28%, and it's now 20%, although there was significant growth for quite some time there. And India has grown from 2% to 39%. And those other countries that were listed as potential target has actually gone from 18% of the total to 9%. And then we have all other countries where 20 years ago, 53% of the international students were coming from other countries other than those listed there. And now that's only 32%, so a little less diverse. And international students from India and China, it's interesting to compare how the growth rate in the international students in those 2 different sectors of our post-secondary system are actually quite different. So just reflecting on the total headcount enrollment, we see, very steep growth in China, but then even steeper in terms of international students coming from India. And then, of course, there's all the other countries combined. But when we look at how these students distribute themselves in the research-intensive universities, there is fairly steady growth in the share of students entering or enrolling in the research universities, currently at 35% China. But in the colleges and the institutes and the TIUs, a bit of a drop there. It's now only 10% of the enrollment in the colleges and institutes and the TIUs are from China. So India, a bit of growth in the research-intensive universities, but nowhere near as significant as the share of international students from India in the other institution types. And of course, international students are not equally represented in all of our program areas. So I've just plotted here the percentage of international students by the different program areas. And even though currently we have 19% of the total post-secondary enrollment are international, the share of international students in business is about double that, which is 38%, which you can see plotted as the top line there. And you can see that the share of international students in other programs. Hello? I think the mic just cut out there. So anyways, you can see the variation in the share of international students. So in terms of international enrollment growth, this is impacting student transition rate trends overall. We know that the immediate entry transition rate trend in the province is declining a little bit over time. For the resident students, as a proxy for domestic students, their transition rates to BC public post-secondary education hasn't really dipped too much. But when we look at the non-resident students or the international students, we see that there is a decline in their transition rate. And so as the number of international students grows and their transition rates are actually becoming smaller, that's pulling down the overall transition rate for the province. And we can look at the academic performance of international and domestic students. We see that the performance in terms of term GPAs, domestic students have higher GPAs consistently for each of the fall terms that I looked at over the last decade or so. We see that domestic students have higher performance than international students. And we can also look at attrition rates, where we take students who've entered grade 12, and then we identify the proportion who dropped out of the BC public system, not just the institution where they began, but anywhere in the system. And then we keep looking for the next 4 years, and if we don't see them, then we consider them to be part of that attrition rate. And you can see that that attrition rate is higher for international students at almost 10%, compared to 6.4% for the domestic students. So this might suggest that maybe our international students need some additional academic support. So but before I move on to the last section on COVID-19, any quick questions? I think I've got about 4 minutes left. Oh, questions. We need a microphone.
Thanks. I just had a question about the drop-off rate. Do you have any data on how many of those international students actually became domestic, or do you track that? How many students have changed status to PR or become citizens in that time?
I did track that once. That's something we can track. But in that particular statistic, what I did is I took the students' status at the time that they graduated, so they would have been international or domestic according to their non-resident status, and then track them into post-secondary. So if they changed their status, that wouldn't have affected their attrition rate. But I do have some data that identifies the students who changed their status. So you can ask me about that at some other point. Yes.
This is a little bit general, but earlier you mentioned kind of in passing that 10-year graduation rate or 10-year connection rate hitting 81, and you said something about maybe 7% of students not being captured because they left the province or went to privates. Mm-hmm. Just curious if like how you infer that, if you've actually been able to find any data that supports that, because obviously that's a big question.
Yeah, I kind of alluded to it earlier where I said we actually link into the student financial assistance data, and we look at where those students applied for financial assistance, and if they enrolled in the BC private or a non-BC institution, we can identify them as part of that transition rate that's not counted in the official BC public transition rate statistics. So we do have that data. It's not perfect because students who don't apply for financial assistance wouldn't be included. So that's why we have to sort of say, at least 5 to 7% go on to privates or non-BC.
Thank you.
Okay, so I'll move on to the last section of my presentation. So how did COVID affect transition rates of different subpopulations. We kind of alluded to this earlier with the Indigenous students. When we look at that pandemic graduate cohort of 2019-20, we see there is a bigger dip in the transition rate for that group, starting to recover, of course. So we'll see if that continues as a positive trend. We can also look at the students who had high GPAs when they graduated, which is 75% or higher, and they have traditionally had higher transition rates into post-secondary education than students whose GPAs upon graduation were 75% or lower. And what we see is that there has been a continued widening of the gap between those two groups, and during the COVID year that was no different. I also had a slide, but I didn't provide it, which is to show the difference in the transition rates for students with special needs compared to those who did not have special needs. And also for that group, we saw a widening in the transition rate gap for those two different groups. What about median family income? Did median family income influence transition to post-secondary education during the pandemic? If we look at the distribution of our immediate entry students by median family income, we see there's really no substantial difference between those distribution curves. And so here I've plotted the distribution of our immediate entry students before the pandemic. This is the distribution of those students across the various ranges of family income. And when we look at the pandemic graduates of 2019-20, it seems that there is really no substantial difference in those distributions of the students across income. And did COVID-19 impact post-secondary enrollment? So if we look at just that section here between the pre-pandemic to the sort of the classic 2020, 2021 enrollment year, we see in the colleges a 6% drop in just that 1 year period in the post-secondary enrollment. Institutes was actually up by 2%. Now, of course, these are headcounts, not FTEs, so it could be quite a different story if you look at FTEs, but I'm not able to quantify FTEs. And then in the research-intensive universities, they were up 2%. And then in the TIUs, it was down 3%. So there did seem to be some impact on the post-secondary enrollment due to COVID, and one could drill down and look at all kinds of different subpopulations, but there's no time for that today. But there will be a 20-year report that will be released, not this fall, but it'll be next fall. There's also, if you're looking for something more immediate, there is a report available on the STP website, and it's on the grade 12 transitions from high school into post-secondary, and there's lots of information in that report on student enrollments and so forth. There's also another report which will come up on the next slide, which is on student mobility. It has not yet been released, sort of held up in the logjam somewhere, but it will also be available on the STP website. But I think I might have time for 1 or 2 questions.
Any questions? Please put your hands up.
There's one there.
Hi, Joanne. Is this on now? Yeah, hi, Andrew Armour from VIU. Maybe just a fun one for you. I feel fortunate I've been able to take in presentations from you on STP over the last number of years. And I know you have to make decisions about what you present on. You have such a huge data set. And I've heard you a number of times say, oh, connect with me later about that, and I'll talk to you. I'm just curious if over all these years, if you could comment on some of the more unique or unusual requests you get about data.
Oh my goodness. You're putting me on the spot here. The most unique and unusual requests about data. Can I think about that one? I don't know, they're all unique and unusual in some way. Some are easier to answer than others. Yeah, sorry, I don't think I can answer that one. There's a question from your colleague next to you. Thanks for the question. I'll think about it.
I've got one. Rob Ferguson, VIU. Thank you, Andrew, for the prompt. Do you see a geographic difference in mobility in the province? So looking at the mainland, northern BC versus Vancouver Island.
Yes, there is a geographic distance. It's actually in this report that's flipping by you here. what we find is that there's a lot of student mobility going on within the Lower Mainland, and that's likely due to the proximity of the institutions to each other. Not quite so much student mobility going, say, from the Lower Mainland to the north and vice versa. So yeah, most of that mobility is occurring within the Lower Mainland, but then of course there's that kind of unusual one with Thompson Rivers University being so accessible for online learning. So it appears as though there's this huge amount of mobility into the Thompson, Okanagan, Kootenay region, but of course you're not physically moving, you're just enrolling and attending remotely in many cases.
We have a few questions from the online audience, if you don't mind. This one I'm going to paraphrase a little bit. It's about private institutions who have asked in the past for to have their students penned or given personal education number. Currently, they're not. And I wonder if you can give any update. Has there been any movement or change in that direction? And who can they ask if they want to advocate on their behalf?
This is a question that's probably beyond my ability to answer. I think that's sort of something that is handled within the Ministry of Post-Secondary Education and Future Skills. So I don't know what the status on that is.
Okay. So they should contact the Ministry of Post-Secondary Education.
I think so.
I'll direct them to you, Ben. There's another question from the online audience. How much of the growth in degrees can be attributed to the growth of international students? And in brackets it says, "Hi, Joanne." It's from David Johnson from UFE.
Skippy! David Johnson, blast from the past. We worked together at SFU many years ago. So the question was about the proportion of degrees awarded to international students. Yes, there's a significant growth attributed to international students, but I don't have any statistics rolling around my head. He can contact me anytime if he wants me to give him some more meaningful data.
All right. Do we have any more questions from the room? All right. Well, then I would just like to thank Joanne once again. That was fascinating, really amazing stuff. So thank you for that. And just a reminder, Joanne's slides and information will be available on the Whova app. So if you have follow-up questions, please feel free to do so. We are going to take a quick break. Please be back at 2 o'clock. So please refresh your coffees, and we'll be back for our session on micro-credentials. Thank you.